entre 2011 y 2019. El trabajo de Anette ha sido reconocido con numerosos premios. Fue elegida miembro de la Academia Europea de Sociología este año. También recibió el premio Rosabeth Moskanter a la excelencia en la investigación sobre trabajo y familia 2 veces, en 2018 y en 2022. Y en 2023 fue honrada con el título de doctora honorario de la Universidad de Turku en Finlandia. La investigación de Anette es prolífica e influyente. Ha publicado extensamente en revistas como Sociological Methods and Research, Social Forces, Demography, American Journal of Sociology, European Sociological Review y Advances in Life Course Research, por nombrar algunas. Algunos de sus trabajos recientes incluyen estudios sobre curso de vida y desigualdad social en varios países europeos, el impacto del empleo de los padres en la educación de los niños en Alemania y la división de género del trabajo doméstico durante la pandemia del COVID. Anette también es una docente apasionada, imparte una variedad de cursos en la Universidad de Humboldt que van desde cursos introductorios sobre familia y demografía hasta seminarios avanzados de desigualdad social e investigación del curso de vida. Ha dirigido también numerosas tesis doctorales y esos tesis doctorales han ganado prestigiosos premios. La trayectoria de Anette muestra claramente su dedicación e influencia en la sociología. Su investigación, docencia y trabajo profesional han mejorado enormemente nuestra comprensión de la desigualdad social, la dinámica del curso de vida y los cambios demográficos. Hoy nos va a presentar algunos de los principales resultados de su proyecto de investigación High Hopes and Broken Promises, Young Adult Life Courses and Political Progress in the Global South. Welcome, Anette, and thank you for being with us in this new version of the conference of our research center.
Buenas tardes, gracias Ignacio, gracias Diana. I'm very sorry I don't speak Spanish, it will have to be in English. But thank you so much for the kind introduction and thank you very much for inviting me to Chile. It's really a great honor to be here and I've already learned a lot. So today I'm going to talk about actually a series of projects I've been working on: High Hopes and Broken Promises, Young Adult Life Courses and Political Protest in the Global South. And it's a collaborative effort, and here you see the main people below that I've been working on with this in this project, and I want to point out Binda Nyati, Sokhna Njai, Mariam Sis, Nancine Dour, and Assa Kamara, who are all Senegalese/Congolese postdocs and assistant professors with whom this project that I'm going to mainly be focusing on today is very much a collaborative effort. So as Ignacio already mentioned, we have a research center in Berlin called Scripts, Contestations of the Liberal Script, and we're ending our first 7-year funding period. And sort of the focus of Scripts, we have 30 PIs, very interdisciplinary, actually a little bit similar in some respect to COES, but also different. But our main topic has been challenges to the liberal model of societies. So is the liberal model of societies really on decline? And we take here a historical, global, and comparative perspective and understand the liberal script. I mean, we still argue the first couple of years, we were only arguing what is the liberal script. Every discipline has different ideas. It's not easy, but we kind of have a base definition of it's descriptive and prescriptive, so what is and what should be knowledge about the organization of society based on individual self-determination or a balance of individual and collective self-determination. These are both parts of liberalism, and often the concrete forms are democracy, property rights, advanced capitalism, rule of law, maybe a mature welfare state. And while we have been studying the liberal script, numerous contestations have been arising and deepening, we now argue. So our questions are, which challenges to liberalism are intensifying around the globe? What strengthens the resilience? Maybe are there ways in which liberal societies can adapt to challenges? And what are alternative non-liberal scripts that are rising? So my projects in Scripts have focused very much on young adults in different regions of the world. Why young adults? So I'm a life course sociologist from my background, And in the life course paradigm, we see that social change can sometimes happen really suddenly from one day to another, COVID or something like that. But often social change happens very slowly, and a key driver of social change is also cohort replacement. Old people dying, young people coming into the world, and young adulthood is seen as a formative period in the life course where often the young people are agents of social change. So that's one reason I'm focusing on young adults. Now, the liberal script makes several key promises that are particularly relevant, I think, to young adults. For example, education will lead to employment and prosperity, so there will be returns to education. Then those who work hard will not be poor. Children have better life chances than their parents. That's the narrative of upward mobility. There's roughly, for younger generations, equal opportunities based on meritocratic principles, and you will have a democracy, freedom of speech, and a diversity of life forms, which is all kind of related to minority rights. So far the promises, this all sounds great, but how does it really look like in reality? Around the globe, the experiences of young adults are increasingly contradicting these promises, we argue, to not everywhere, to very much different degrees and in locally specific ways. And this is what we're trying to study in a comparative approach. And what you see here is an Africa-centered world map, and the little red dot here, that's where Senegal is. And for today, I put it at the center of the world, because I'm mostly going to be focusing on Senegal. But let's spend just a couple minutes in the global perspective when we look at these broken promises in the global north. What is the global north? I mean, maybe even Chile belongs to the global north, I thought when I came here. So obviously the global north, global south distinction is misleading. It's not a geographic one. What do we actually mean? We talk about it now also as the minority world, because it's actually, if you look at the world population, a minority, about 15% of the world population live in global north countries. But what we really mean is affluent capitalist democracies with mature welfare states and large formal labor markets that integrate people and provide a means of security, economic security. So here we see, especially generations born after 1980, the millennials have it on average harder than their parents, rising inequality, also to attain typical markers of adulthood, economic independence, buying a house, forming a family. We also see a rising share of working poor households. If you think about the promises, that's another broken promise also across Europe. Equality of opportunity is now widely recognized as a myth, and we do see the rise of political polarization, right-wing voting, and alternative scripts. For example, 2 days ago, as you all know, Donald Trump got elected, and he had the largest gains, 6% more than in 2020 among voters aged 18 to 29. And also, so the largest gains came from young adults here in the Trump election. Also in Germany, our ruling coalition just dissolved 2 days ago. We will have new elections. And in the last regional elections, the right-wing party AfD got a much higher share and the highest share among young people also. So we see really a polarization and a rise of right-wing voting, especially among the young in many countries. Now let's turn to this term of the global south. What do we actually mean here? Another term we've been using more is the majority world, because the majority of the world population actually lives in low and middle income countries with colonial histories, specifically histories of being colonialized. Often there's population growth coupled with urbanization without industrialization. I think that's important because in Europe in the 19th century, we had urbanization with industrialization that then kind of led to economic growth, which we don't have in these countries necessarily. Then there are weak states, weak welfare states, and very large informal labor markets, ranging from anywhere between 20 to 30%, which I think are figures that apply to some countries in Latin America, up to 90% informal labor market, as we will see exist in Senegal and much of sub-Saharan Africa. But also in these countries, and here we did a prior study on Egypt, we see downward generational change since independence. Many of these countries became independent around 1960, and the young adults today feel they are worse off than their parents, where becoming independent actually would raise expectations that we will have better lives than our parents. Then there has been massive educational expansion, again, raising expectations. If I'm educated, I should collect returns. But there's a lack of especially formal employment, simply because there is so little formal employment. Markers of adulthood are increasingly difficult to attain. And we see a resurgence of religious radicalization, for example, in the MENA, Middle East and North African region, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, a gender backlash and a rise of alternative authoritarian scripts. So today I already said I'm focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. Why? So here you see UN population projections. The purple line is sub-Saharan Africa, and it's actually the only world region where we still expect massive population growth in the 21st century. So it is the continent of the future for the 21st century. Now, why specifically did we choose Senegal? So in Senegal, we have particularly high hopes because there's a strong implementation of liberal principles. In the region, it's a country with comparatively little violent conflict since independence. There have been several peaceful changes of power, relatively regular elections. There's a very moderate version of Islam, which I think has shielded it from religious radicalization. We've had rapid educational expansion, and it's also relatively prosperous in the region. But still, so you have this implementation of liberal principles. There's a very high youth unemployment despite education, downward generational change, labor market informality. And so we started this project in 2020 and 2019, and first we got hit by COVID, and historically for the first time Europeans couldn't enter Africa anymore, so that delayed us. And then a series of youth protests actually unfolded while we were in the field. So which we chose it because there had been little protests, but then suddenly protests were happening there too, and now we have measurements around these protests. And we also see a rise of irregular migration. Now, in the next slides, I'm briefly going to walk you through the high hopes and broken promises, and then talk specifically about what we assessed in our interviews, how young adults cope with unfulfilled occupational aspirations, and how this relates to their support and participation in the protests. So here you see for the region OECD figures on occupational aspirations, and the blue lines are professionals. So you see the share of students wishing to work in the public sector, so these professionals in the public sector, including international organizations and non-governmental organizations, is particularly high in Africa, where it ranges from 65% in Tanzania to 78% in Zambia. And contrast this to the labor market being 90% informal. And I think these are also images still from colonial times. What many young people want to do, they want to work in an air-conditioned office where you wear a shirt and you have a contract and a formal salary and so on. But there's really a structural mismatch between these aspirations and the labor market reality. Even among university graduates, almost 20% were unemployed and many more were underemployed or performed low-skill informal work. And what we found striking, I will show you some figures now from the demographic and health surveys on returns to education. So here you see for different birth cohorts from the 1970s to 1990, the probability to work, be in any kind of job. And we see that after 1980, the lines kind of diverge, and the lowest dot is actually the higher educated, and the two higher dots are the lower educated. So we find that highly educated people have lower probabilities to work because they're not finding commensurate employment than the lower educated, who simply have to perform any kind of work. Another indicator, this is also taken from the demographic and health surveys, where we looked across cohorts born from the 1960s, when Senegal became independent, until 1990. a simple count of household property. So measures like household income don't really make sense in Senegal, given the high degree of informality and because a lot of the economy happens based on barter trades. Many people don't have bank accounts and so on, no regular salaries. So this is a simple household property index that counts, does your household own one of the following things? Electricity, radio, a television, a refrigerator, a bicycle, a motorcycle. And you see the 1960s cohorts, they had about 1.5 of these things. Then it jumps up to about 2.5, but there has been a stall since. So there's no improvement. And think about all the hopes that come with becoming independent, ending colonialism and so on, but there's really this stall. Also, we see that there's been now just recently family formation, becoming married, and parents has been delayed, especially for men who can't pay bride wealth anymore and for highly educated young adults. I'm briefly going to skip these next 2 slides, but that's what they show, sort of a delay of family formation. So overall, we do see these high hopes, but the realities are quite different. And our core research questions in this project were, how do young adults make a living and form families in contexts with limited job opportunities? How do they cope with unfulfilled occupational aspirations? And which coping strategies predict support of and participation in the political protests? And then finally, coming back to the liberal scripts idea, also we are researching what is the role of these social and these youth movements for the liberal script and its contestations in Senegal. Theoretically, this is embedded in the life course paradigm, also the idea, some ideas on generations, cohort size, and life chances. And we're also looking at different concepts there are for capturing young adulthood, like transitions to adulthood or emerging adulthood that emerged in the global north. And then you also have some concepts that were developed in global south youth studies, like hustling and improvisations or waithood. And what we try to do here is bring together concepts from these 2 literatures and see what applies. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. So we take a multiple methods approach. For me, I'm usually a quantitative social science scientist working with longitudinal admin and survey data. And this has been a real opportunity in scripts to really do something different in a different world region. So we did ethnographic field work in Dakar since 2020. Binda Nyati, especially our postdoc, was there a lot. She's now an assistant professor in Cambridge, which is great. And then we have these 3 Senegalese assistant professors / postdocs who spent longer time periods also in Berlin. And now recently in 2024, we did some field work in Touba, which is the capital of the Murid Brotherhood, to understand how the Muslim Brotherhoods actually operate in Senegal. Then we did these qualitative autobiographical interviews, where here it's really important from the beginning, our Senegalese collaborators were very much involved in every step of the research, designing the questionnaires. We did focus group with Senegalese young adults to design the questionnaires. And then we interviewed young adults in 2021, 2023, and 2024. So it was quite challenging because of COVID confinements. And then when there were these waves of protests, there would be curfews, the interviews had to be rescheduled. Sometimes the government turned off the internet. We couldn't even Zoom with people. So it was really a very intense experience. But we have these 3 waves for 23 people. And we did a type of snowball sampling with quotas to cover high and low education, urban versus rural regions. Roughly, we have ages 20 to 40. And the interviews switch between the local language Wolof and French. And so they were all conducted by our Senegalese collaborators, and they transcribed them. And then we analyze them in MaxQDA, and then we discuss our interpretations in the researcher team and now also with the participants. Then we also did expert interviews with leaders of the protest movements, local activists, and also policymakers, leading personalities of the Muslim Brotherhoods. And we're working on quantitative analysis with the demographic and health surveys. And Scripps collected a data set on public attitudes towards the liberal script that actually includes Chile and Brazil. And we just released this data set, so might be interesting for some of you to check it out. It's publicly available. And Chile is an outlier on some of these scales. So I'm not sure what we're actually measuring there, but in terms of their attitudes to liberalism, so maybe you want to take a look and have some idea of what might be going on. Now, research ethics was a big topic for us. How do we as Western researchers enter these regions? How can we work with social scientists there? As I said, we were really lucky to find these 5 Senegalese women that I worked with over the years and without whom this would have been absolutely impossible. And what we did now at the end, as part of our also sort of outreach dissemination activities, we collaborated with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. It's a German foundation associated with the Green Party, their regional office in Dakar, and had a 3-day youth assembly where we invited the participants of our interviews and some other local activists and experts to discuss with them the findings of our interviews, also the role of Western researchers in sub-Saharan Africa. We had kind of focus group discussions and debates. So here you see some pictures. And at the very end, I want to show you a brief interview where some of our participants, so that you just get an idea of who these people are and can hear their voices. It's just 3 minutes. But let me first move through our core findings. So the first question was, how do young adults make a living? And here we started with sort of these concepts of young adulthood, the life stage of young adulthood. And here we really discovered that existing concepts of young adult life courses are normatively and empirically inaccurate to capture biographical experiences in Senegal. For example, this idea of transitions to adulthood that many Europeans and North Americans work with implies that it's a one-time irreversible transition from school to formal work and sort of an orderly sequence of family formation. But what we see in sub-Saharan Africa and Senegal specifically, there are multiple, very frequently shifting sources of livelihood, and there is no 3 months they do this, then they mix income from varying other sources, and this whole idea of a one-time irreversible transition doesn't make any sense. Then there's this concept by Jeffrey Arnett, also bridged into psychology, of emerging adulthood, that tried to describe why in the Western world young adults were delaying their transitions to adulthood. And this ties to sort of the Ingelhard post-materialism theories, that young adults have post-materialist values, they want to self-explore, have values of self-expression and so on, and for that reason they delay adulthood. But that also totally doesn't apply to sub-Saharan Africa, where materialist concerns are still very much an everyday reality. And also when we look at some of the concepts from Global South studies, like the idea of waithood by Singerman and Honwana has become very prominent, that because traditional markers aren't attainable, young adults are stuck in this protracted period of waithood. But this somehow suggests that it's an idle waiting that is temporary and at some point is going to end. And what we see instead is that it's a possibly enduring and very busy sort of hustling period between livelihood opportunities. Our participants, they don't just sit on the street and are depressed and wait for something to happen, but they're constantly busy to try to find opportunities to make things happen, also to not appear waiting and to somehow build a life. And what we propose instead as a concept, and here I worked with 2 anthropologists, Edmuta Alba and Iris Clemens, who are African studies people, is the idea of making a living as an enduring and relational process of finding one's place and being recognized as a full and responsible member in a given society. And I just briefly want to highlight this idea of relational and process. So it's possibly enduring and there is no sort of clear-cut transition. And the relational is important because in contexts where you have very informal labor markets and weak states, access to resources is governed by personal and family networks or religious communities. So a lot of these access to opportunities, we see that a lot in our interview, yes, but then an old school friend's father in the end helped me out, or I didn't have any money, so I turned to my local sheikh of my Muslim community, and he gave me a small loan, and so on. So this is how we look at this process. So let me give you a first few quotes from our qualitative interviews. Most of them are searching for employment, see themselves as entrepreneurs, working multiple short-term jobs, but they don't add up to a living wage. A typical answer is, and this is somebody who's already 40, I'm into a lot of things. I trained in plumbing and welding, but I started out in catering. Right now, I've put everything on hold to go back to breeding and farming. So it's often sort of a list of things, and then, but it turns out that they can't really generate a lot of income. One thing that I found very striking in the interviews, and there's a paper by Margaret Fry who has that proposes this concept of occupational aspirations as assertions of identity, because you really ask yourself, if it's so difficult and unrealistic really to attain a lot of their occupational aspirations, why do they hold on to these occupational aspirations? And one reason is, if I can't be what I want to be today, then I define myself through what I want to become in the future. And I think this is one reason why people hold on to high occupational aspirations. For example, Asa, here a younger participant who's a married mother, dropped out of her training and is doing sort of odd jobs to support her kids, says, I've always dreamed of working in the health sector. And so far, it's still my dream, assisting someone who suffers until they no longer feel pain. In fact, that's the love I have for myself. So you kind of see it's a really important part of her self-description that this is the occupation she aspires to. What we saw across the waves of the interview is that initially, often also the younger participants frame this sort of hustling improvisations as temporary and say, yeah, I'm doing this now, but in the future I'm going to work in the profession I trained for. But as they become older, and also in the course of our 3 waves, more and more participants accept it as permanent. And this is a key shift for their coping narrative. So then once you accept this as actually not transitional, but it's permanent, then you think differently about how you have to act on it. So when they say, je suis entrepreneur, I'm an entrepreneur, this is usually what this means. Maybe they have a little sewing store or a little cafe store. And you see a lot of these roaming around the streets of Dakar with very little customers or very little interaction. Another key point is almost all of our participants clearly say that their parents had it easier. Here, one of them says, the times aren't the same. We can have more income than them, but their times were easier. With the few means they had, they could achieve a lot, have a house, wives, manage a family of any number. But now life is so expensive, it's hard to get by. I think their time was easier. They were more stable than us. And a version of this appears in a lot of narratives. So we here again see this assertion of unfulfilled aspirations. So how do young adults cope with this difficult situation? Here we looked in the psychological literature on coping strategies, which of course is vast and very large, but there are very many different classifications. And one thing for our research that we really found lacking was a sociological perspective that looks how individual narratives relate to broader social scripts of liberalism, neocolonialism, and so on. And that's something we're trying to get at here. And we developed a typology of 4 main coping strategies, the RICE typology that we call resignation, so basically giving up. Internalization is buying into the liberal narrative of, oh, I just didn't work hard enough, or it's my own responsibility to pull me out of this mess. Contestation is a critique of the structural conditions. And then the escape frame for us is tightly linked to migration intentions and migration. Now, young adults frequently switch between these coping narratives, for example, between blaming their generation, which would be internalizing liberal narratives, or blaming the state. And we do see that across the 3 waves, the dominant coping mechanisms for some shift from internalization more to resignation or contestation. And so the coping narratives typically shift when people see their difficult situation as permanent and no longer as temporary. So I think that's a key point when you kind of think, wait a minute, something's really not working here and I might have to change how I deal with it. So the resignation frame is when young adults really accept and adjust to performing low status work. They have no expectation of positive change and accept that the liberal narrative is not working for them. You've gone everywhere you should have gone, done everything you should have done, but you still can't work. And then there's sort of a positive variant, which is sort of just accepting and adjusting. There's no such thing as a silly job, or I don't have many worldly desires, are quotes here. But there's also a negative variant where you feel that it's really sort of despair, hopelessness, a very fatalistic view on the world. Here you are wasting away with your diplomas, but still every morning you have to get up and face your family. The internalization frame really buys into these liberal narratives, which a lot of the NGOs, UNESCO Futures of Education Initiative and so on are also pushing. The importance of individual responsibility, hard work, and self-reliance. So diplomas and experience don't make things easier, but we don't give up. We try every time. Or it's up to us young people. We shouldn't expect too much from the state. It's true that after your training, you aspire to become someone, but if God has made it so that you don't have a job in the public service, it's up to you to create your own job. So this whole idea of, usually if they don't have a job, they either say, I'm an entrepreneur or I'm a poet. And the first president, Senghor, was a poet. So I think there's this sort of strong attachment here, but these are kind of occupational identities that pop up when they actually really don't have a job. So there's also this, they rarely say, I'm lazy and it's my own fault, but very often blaming their generation. So I see people who submit a project, once they get funding, they eat up the money without achieving anything. In the end, it is said that these are the people who have no dream. All they want is to earn money without getting tired. Or we want to work, but we don't want a hard job. We want to have iPhones to have a good life without working. So there's this also quite strong. But then, as I said, as they become older, or also in the later waves of the interview, more and more people switch to this contestation frame of really critiquing structural conditions. On a global level, mainly directed at the French. If all the money produced doesn't stay here on French companies, it's useless. What is happening is neocolonialism in full view of everyone and about how the French education system needs to be changed and so on. And then also a critique, and there's a local variant more critiquing bad governance and corruption. So you steal 2 chickens and you are in prison, but someone steals billions with the knowledge of everyone and he goes about his business, about the local corruption. And this frame is very strongly associated to higher education and then political activism. And then there's also the escape frame and discussing migration as a high risk, high reward option. So if you can't do anything in Senegal, maybe migration is the only way out. Barça, Vale, Barshak is Wolof for Barcelona or die. And here I think it's very striking that they are all aware that it's very difficult. So imagine going abroad without any papers, being a fugitive from the police in the morning and evening, homeless with all the racism that exists. But still, there's this hope we see when people leave to emigrate, they manage to build houses and buy cars. So it's really kind of most of them say, I want to stay in Senegal, but if it's just so hard here, you can't expect us not to try. And this was a big topic also when we discussed our findings with the participants. And then, of course, there's family pressure. Here you see a few pictures in the top. Those are the pirogues, the fisher boats that they really, I was quite shocked. And there are these wooden shells that they try to get to Europe with. And the other thing is a mural at the coast of Dakar where you see these shoes leading into the sea and faces of people who have died. So it's very present there. Everybody's talking about our young people are dying in the sea and we have to do something against it. What you see down there is an image one of our participants provided us. He tried to emigrate and they made it into Cape Verde. It was a really terrible journey. His friend died and then they were repatriated immediately. And we have a few of these failed returned migrants, very intense interviews also, who then also are much more likely to engage in political activism because it's kind of this, I don't have anything to lose and this route didn't work for me either. So these 4 coping strategies. Now the third question, how do these coping narratives relate to participation and support of the protests? As I said, there was a wave of protests that started against the COVID confinements, but it was always very much about a lack of youth employment. And then Macky Sall, the former president, was trying to run for a 3rd term, which is unconstitutional. And in the end, he also didn't succeed. So the Supreme Court in Senegal ruled against it, but so there were really quite violent protests, then looting, burning of French supermarkets and so on, because it was seen that the French were supporting him. And now they have a young leader, Diomaye Faye, who is 44 years old, left-leaning, very much tries to sort of renegotiate contracts with the West, wants to push Wolof as the local language and so on. But he had lots of troubles in parliament. He didn't get his laws passed and he dissolved the parliament and there will be new elections now in November too. But anyways, there's been a lot going on. So how are our coping strategies associated then with these protests? So participation and approval of the protest is strongest for young adults who adopt this contestation narrative, are highly educated and unemployed, accept unfulfilled aspirations as permanent and no longer temporary, switch between these internalization and contestation narratives, or the failed return migrants who have nothing to lose. On the other hand, we got very sort of detached and general or uninformed answers about the protests from respondents in the resignation and internalization, who switched between resignation and internalization. That's kind of like, I've accepted this, I don't want anything to do with it. I don't even know what it was about, but these are few actually. Most of them were very engaged and they support the aims of the protest, but denounce the violence and looting. So the Senegalese are very proud to be one of the most peaceful countries in the region, and there's very strong sentiments about the violence. And I think thinking about liberalism, what's interesting, there are 2 aims of the protests. One is democracy, defending the constitution, so there should not be a 3rd term, that's unconstitutional, and a fight against nepotism and corruption, which is really upholding liberal principles. But the second issue of youth employment and renegotiating contracts with the West, here I think it's really a contestation to the liberal model that hasn't delivered on its promises. So you have independence, democracy, educational expansion, but economically it's just not working. And what I think was very interesting, what came out really strongly in our interviews, is that extended families and the religious communities contain and channel the protest. So lots of people say, I very much support the protest, I post content on social media all the time, but I didn't take to the streets because my parents and my family disapprove of this very much, and that's why I don't do it. And also, when the parents approve, it's seen as a sign of this protest is legitimate. And also the leaders of the Muslim brotherhoods, they're kind of a background power very much in Senegal, also mediated between the protesters and the government. So the president, Macky Sall, when the protest first started, tried multiple times, please go home, stop the looting, and so on. Everything continued, nothing happened. But then, and we actually talked to one of the religious leaders who negotiated the protest in the expert interviews. When the Brotherhood said, stop this, half an hour later, the streets were empty. So they are still very powerful. And I think it's because they're kind of a shadow welfare state. Or maybe I'll just continue with this here. So what the Muslim Brotherhoods do provide is sort of a religious frame and community organization that rejects the Western concept of formal employment, which obviously isn't working there, and offers an attainable source of self-worth through community service and religious virtue they're kind of like often act as a welfare state in lack of real welfare benefits and sort of structure typical life courses and structure the course of a day. And I think this is also the reason why they are very powerful in sort of, if I don't know if you want to call it social cohesion or what exactly social cohesion is, but in channeling this discontent and still providing sort of an outlet for young people. As I said, I think I already said all of this, so let me move more towards the end. What can be done? Also something we discussed a lot was various people, and then often what they say first is, well, you have to improve the match between skills and jobs. The French system we have here is bad. It doesn't prepare people for the labor market. We need a different education system. And I think that's partly true, but that still doesn't create jobs. So still 90% of the labor market is informal, and still you don't have it's a deeper structural problem. So I think what I learned in this project, you need structural solutions for these structural problems in these regions. What can you do here? So less agricultural imports, let them develop their own agricultural markets. Most of the onions, vegetables, and so on are imported from the European Union to Senegal, for example. It's crazy. Less agricultural monocultures. Senegal builds very heavily on peanut trade, which, by the way, is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhoods. Then another point is supporting capital accumulation, reversing structural adjustment of the 1990s. So also in our Egypt project and other projects, we see structural adjustment by the World Bank and so on, International Monetary Fund. These measures led to a shrinking of the public sector. This was very detrimental, especially for women, and the decline of the public sector is a big problem in economies where the market isn't working, where you don't have functioning capitalist labor markets. So I think public sector expansion, looking into the public sector is important. Then maybe investing in industrialization and production of tradable goods, although there's an argument by economists, Harvard economist Roderick, I think his name, who says industrialization cannot be the solution for sub-Saharan Africa anymore. Tradable goods manufacturing, because the world market is already swamped by cheap manufacturing goods from East Asia and other regions of the world. So there is kind of no more room for them to place themselves competitively on the world market. And then a really important point that the current government is pushing is this renegotiation of contracts with the West, like on fishing rights, where they gave a lot of their fishing rights to the European Union and just trying to have more fair deals. And I think, for example, abolishing the agricultural subsidies in the European Union would help the Senegalese agricultural market much more than any type of developmental aid Europe is sending. Okay, that's then I'm coming to the end here. So what's the bottom line? We do see it is a pretty explosive situation. The population of Senegal is expected to double within 25 years. So there's very high population growth in all of these countries in the region. We have a growing group of unemployed, educated youth. By policymakers routinely describe them as a bomb, and everything will depend on how politics deals with this population bomb. And we do see a political destabilization and Islamist radicalization in the region. If you think about Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, there have been coups d'etats, the Islamic State is pouring in from the north. So it's, and also not super hopeful. What we plan to do with this project is, in the next funding period, if we get it, we will do a mirror project where, together with the Senegalese collaborators, we will study German young adult life courses to see if those in sort of left behind areas partly adopt similar narratives, and to just have a very straight learning from each other's gaze on the respective other contexts. That's, I think, also an important thing in terms of research ethics, and to expand this to a Pan-African comparison to disentangle drivers of resilience of elements of the liberal script. Final words. I think youth movements and protests, first we thought of them as these probably are some form of contestation of liberalism, but they're not. They can really be a motor of resilience or a contestation depending on their aims and means. I think the youth protests also were very instrumental in ensuring that the constitution is not violated by a third term and things like that. So the violence obviously is a radicalization that is a contestation, but these aims and means are often mixed, and that's why it's kind of difficult to disentangle them. And the contestations to liberalism primarily arise from failed economic promises in these regions. I think that's very clear, and there is a temporal dynamic to it that I'm personally particularly interested in, both in terms of the downward mobility across generations and in terms of life course processes. So when there's an expiration date on these promises on the future of liberalism. If I'm 40 and I'm still struggling to kind of build my life, then I don't see it as temporary anymore and my behavior changes. Okay, before we go into discussion, I briefly wanted to show you, this is a video that the Heinrich Böll Stiftung made of our youth assembly that we held with the young adults. And it's maybe just an example of kind of the outreach knowledge exchange products we are trying to generate in the cluster, where I'm also interested how you're doing this in COES, and also that you get a sense. Some of these people are participants that you will hear speaking, not all of them, but that you get an idea.
Je suis aujourd'hui ici au musée Théodore Monod dans le cadre du Pencum Ndaw, l'Assemblée des jeunes, qui est une activité organisée par Heinrich Böll et ses partenaires.
waaw am na solo lool déjà tour bi moo ma ci jëkk impressionné mooy Pencum Ndaw ñi, donc déjà le nom li may wax chaque jour ñun dañuy évoluer tamit ci wàllum valorisation des langues.
Pencum ndaw yi nekk loo xamante ni tey ay ndaw yu daje pour weccoo xalaat soulever problème yi nga xamante ni moom lañ nekk di dund. Essayer nag di trouver maintenant yan solution lañ koy mën a saafaral.
Donc mu nekk yenn activités yoo xam ne dañ ko wax di multiplier et jéem koo décentraliser ba jeunes yëpp mën a ñëw wax seen xalaat ak seen jafe-jafe yi ñu nekk. Donc cadre bi yaakaar naa adapté na ak suñu réalité.
ni ñu ko doxalee mu am tooguwaayu suuf mu am bassin et cetera. Donc déjà voilà, forme bi rek ça fait plaisir, mais rawatina contenu bi. Intervention yi gis naa kenn ku ci nekk li muy wax lu mu maîtriser la, et que man dama ñëwoon pour participer, mais jàngale naa lu bëri ci différentes interventions yi.
Aujourd'hui, cette participation à cette assemblée qui regroupe pas mal de profils intéressants avec des retours d'expérience et des récits de parcours très inspirants. Nous magnifions aussi la qualité des échanges ainsi que toutes les perspectives et enjeux, défis de la jeunesse qu'on a eu à partager, espérant que ça fasse écho au niveau de nos dirigeants.
On a également assisté à des panels qui ont touché pas mal de domaines qui intéressent les jeunes, les questions liées à la migration clandestine, des questions également liées au chômage des jeunes, à l'entrepreneuriat.
L'exercice qu'on m'avait demandé était de partager mon expérience en tant que jeune femme féministe, activiste, et aussi partager les obstacles que nous rencontrons dans l'exercice, dans l'application de cet exercice-là.
Okay, that's the end of it. Oops. So thanks a lot. And here you see the team of the 5 wonderful women who helped me conduct this research.
Muchas gracias, Anette. Tenemos 2 micrófonos allá arriba y el otro está allá a la izquierda para recibir comentarios y... ¿Tenemos traducción? No. Ya, en fin, yo puedo ayudar a traducir si es que hay alguien que quiere preguntar en castellano, siéntase por favor libre de hacerlo.
Thanks for that interesting presentation. Just a brief question. Looking at these issues from Latin America, I was wondering, is there a connection with crime and the situation of the youth that you are describing, which is not massive but common in Latin America, that those issues, an outcome, logical outcome is criminal behavior?
Yes, that's a very good question, and partly for sure. I mean, I think so it doesn't come up. I mean, there's of course a strong social desirability bias, and it does show up in our interviews every now and then that somebody says, you try to do this, you try to do that, and then at some point you're forced to go to means that don't even align with your values and so on. And I think Senegal doesn't have like a big drug trafficking and so on. I think compared to Latin America, that's a bit different here. Yeah, and it's not a huge topic. I mean, not at least not in our interviews, but it does appear to some extent, I would say. But I don't think we really grasp it very well. I mean, one issue that Erdmuta Alba and Iris Clemens, who we were developing this concept of making a living with, they have a somewhat similar project in Benin, but Erdmuta, she's a life course anthropologist, and she studies the same village in rural Benin since the 90s, basically. And what with their participants comes up a lot is sort of cybercrime things and the new possibilities with the internet. So, and I think a lot of our participants, one thing they do if they don't find jobs, they work in a so-called multi-service, which is like a really small shop that you can copy something, but it belongs to somebody else and so on. And in these issues, this whole hustling, I mean, a lot of in the informal economy, I think it's not, a lot of it might be sort of a bit gray area. I think what would be important to investigate more is this whole area of sort of cybercrime and so on. That seems to be an issue in many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
Mi pregunta es más que nada, ¿cómo fue esta decisión de haber tomado estos grupos focales y cómo fue como la diferencia de culturas al momento de entrevistarlo?
The question was, how did you choose the focus group participants?
Mm-hmm. So the first focus groups, we still had 8 interviewers, and we recruited those through Cheikh Anta Diop University, the main university in Dakar. We tried to recruit graduate students in the social sciences, and our postdoc Binda, she has worked in Senegal for her PhD research and has lived there for a long time also through her networks. And then with the 8 interviewers we had, so in the end we only had 3. So the 3 women you see here, Siasa and Mariem, who are all sociology PhDs and stayed with us through all waves. But with these 8 interviewers, we had a 4x4 table telling them they should do like a snowball sampling, but should fulfill certain quotas. And we were looking for young adults who felt that they were downwardly mobile compared to their parents, or were at least had achieved what their parents had achieved, and who had formed independent families or not. And then we kind of tried to fill these cells, and also looked at rural, urban, highly lower educated, and so on, and through the snowball sampling. But in the first wave of interviews, we had still 65 or almost 70 participants, but some of these interviews were really poor and didn't go so well. The second wave, then we only worked with Nosia, Asa, and Mariem. We had 56 participants still, and those were still very rich interviews. And then for the third wave, we have these 23, because some of them were just moved away, left the country. They were very difficult to reach because of the protests and the curfews and everything. So we still have variation, but we definitely have a highly educated bias. So we have more men than women, but I mean, there are women, but I think the women in our sample aren't necessarily typical. They're more outspoken, more independent, and so on. So it's not a representative sample, but we do have an idea, I think, of sort of the biases that are in there. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Anette. Really fascinating. It's somehow ironically that so we both are based in Berlin, and we came to Viña del Mar in order to know better your work. So anyway. I have let's say a broad question, a short question. The broad question concerns the role of colonialism and slavery and so on. So you mentioned in your definition of Global South, the Global South are societies saying confronted with colonial histories. But of course, this applies also to Global North, not only because Canada, US, and so on, but also because the role of the colonizers as colonial powers and how this shaped their histories, and also somehow their present, even today, is there. So therefore, the question will be the first concerning the more general assumption of the liberal scripts. Is this a relevant topic for defining liberal scripts? So especially if you considered how the anti-colonial struggles also shaped the liberal scripts from the perspective of the Global South. So therefore, the question will be a more connected to the general hypothesis. And then in the case of Senegal, curiosity, how, let's say, vocabulary concerning coloniality, the persistence of colonialism, the persistence of new forms of slavery, how this is also present in the interviews and how it shaped the protest. This will be the big question. Not the short question is about aspiration, because you mentioned this sort of so as this is discrepant how aspirations are formulated, even if it's clear that they are not realistic. And this is just to mention a discussion on this made by Arjuna Padurai. I don't know if he used this in the work, because he distinguished between aspiration and actually anticipation, and shows how the not necessarily go together. So you can anticipate things from a cognitive perspective, but from an existential, symbolic perspective, you create aspirations which are somehow disconnected. And one of the factors for this disconnection are social media, are communication with the family members, with friends and so on, living in other parts of the world. So therefore, how these narratives constructed in social media are also relevant for constructing these aspirations.
Yeah, thank you very much for the
Annette?
two questions.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
Can we get together 3 questions and then you answer? Just because we are.
Okay. Thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. I'm trying to be very quick, and this is a question mostly to contextualize the case of Senegal for a Chilean audience, so you understand where exactly they're coming from. I was checking, and apparently Senegal, correct me if I'm mistaken, but they started developing properly. I mean, in terms of average wage increase, it was around 2010-ish, right? And around that period after that, and it's a relatively unequal country, but not particularly so compared to Chile, for instance, considering that you said that it has a high, I mean, most of the society, 90% is actually, most of the economy is informal. In the case of Chile, for example, Chile started developing in terms of rapid growth after 1990, and the Gini, just to give one index of inequality, is 0.5-ish, in Senegal, 0.36. So I was wondering what's the extent and what's the role that inequality plays in this constitution of liberal conscript after 2001, because the reading of it might be very different, considering that the extent of inequality and the time it has had to fester has been different.
Yeah. Really good questions. Maybe I will start with the last one. They're also kind of connected. So the inequality, I'm very skeptical of measures like the Gini or GDP and so on since I started working on non-high income countries, honestly. I mean, many of these households, they have no bank accounts, they have no regular salaries to somehow gauge their quality of life. Things like household property index are much more appropriate. And I really wonder how this features in the Gini indices, the differences, basic food security and things like that. So Senegal, I think one thing, the inequality there is very different, and this has to do with the colonial history. And I think these colonial histories are very important. This now goes to Sergio's question. Also, I corrected myself a little bit because when I was looking at my presentation yesterday, I thought the colonial history, exactly what you said, applies to both. But then I said as being colonized. But I mean, you're totally right. This is just as much part, should be just as much part in this defining what we understand as global north, as having had a living standard for many years they're accustomed to that was only possible by colonial extraction, for example, I think, or we need to think about how to formulate this. But Senegal, so it was always a hotspot for sort of, there's some, Gorée is a famous slave trade island right outside of Dakar, and the Dutch were there, the Portuguese were there, then the French came and so on. But during the French colonial times, the French never really lived there. They just administered the country and extracted resources. So there was a very small ruling colonial elite that didn't intermarry or so on. And I think I know very little, unfortunately, still about Latin America, but I want to learn. And with Ignacio, and as one of the co-editors, we're doing a special issue on young adults from a global perspective, including some Latin American countries. But here my understanding is it's much longer ago, the colonial history, and there was a much stronger mixing of the colonialists with local elites and so on, and the people actually came to live here and stay here and own land, and based on this land ownership became a ruling class. And I think this is very different in Senegal, because when the French left in 1960, it was basically they left. And I mean, now the way the neocolonialism is playing out and turns up in our interviews a lot is economically. The French supermarkets, Auchan, who were other French companies, Orange and so on, who were also really targets of the latest protest waves. But I think the inequality is definitely much different, because Senegal is a much, much poorer country than most countries in Latin America, even the poor ones, I think. So it's rich, relatively rich in the region, but it's just much poorer. And the elite, there is of course a local elite, and that capitalizes also on natural resource extraction and things like that. But it's much, much smaller than my senses of Latin America. But yeah, I would be very interested to extend that conversation. And maybe as an end to Sergio's first question, so yes, I think it's very important looking at these colonial histories. Also, I think partly the aspirations the young people report come from colonial images. It's not something that they necessarily observed in their parents. They say, our parents had it better because prices were lower and they still had land and there were still fish in the ocean. Now there are no more fish in the ocean. A lot of the land, we can't use it anymore because it's too hot, because of climate change and because of the population growth, there's just less land left. But what they aspire to is not the jobs they saw in their parents, but the white shirt, air-conditioned office, and so on, what they saw in the colonial administration. So here I think it plays a role. Padurai's work, I know a little bit, but haven't looked at it specifically here. And in our last round of interviews that we just completed in this summer, we asked them a lot about what did you want to be when you were a child? What did you want to be when you finished your education? When did that change? Do you have any role models in your personal networks that you aspire to, and so on? And so we try to get more what would you like to be? What do you think you will actually be in 5 years? But we're still analyzing this data, but we are trying to disentangle this. Yeah, social media definitely plays a role too, so in terms of the aspirations. Maybe one more thing I wanted to come back about to the crime question, that this is one thing we were discussing in our special issue about Latin America, whether a criminal career is sort of an alternative career when the normal market or when there aren't any other options there, and the narco economy kind of provides also routes to adulthood. And I think in Senegal, this is more the religious communities that is the more obvious alternative if you denounce the classic liberal way. Okay, sorry, lots of questions, lots of answers, but I hope it made sense.
Thank you very much. Le damos un aplauso a Anette. Muchas gracias. So, we have this gift from the center, and there is an additional question that is going to be directly one-on-one.
I think he wants to take a picture with you also. With you now. Bien, muchas gracias. Me toca este rol odioso de controlar el tiempo, pero tenemos una agenda muy apretada. Les quiero recordar que para las mesas, las ponencias, tenemos que terminar en el horario indicado porque hay clases después. Por eso es que estoy tan preocupada. Ya no tenemos flexibilidad. Entonces, vamos a partir el almuerzo como 20 minutos atrasados. Corrámoslo y partamos el siguiente bloque. No sé, ustedes se van a tener que poner de acuerdo, pero eso significa que las mesas de la tarde no van a tener espacio para discutir, van a tener que dejarlo para el café, ¿ok? Solo quiero que tengan eso consciente, que lo avisé ayer, sorry, pero la universidad está funcionando con clases normales. Así que bueno, muchas gracias Anette, muchas gracias Ignacio. El almuerzo va a ser en el patio del edificio F para los asistentes de la conferencia. Muchas gracias a todos los estudiantes UAI que vinieron a escuchar.
Bastian?